Hey guys, this is Joe Harper with Reform Truther Ministries. The topic of today's video is the international banking system. Now, international banking, central banks, and banks in general are topics that are often studied by people who are a part of the Truther movement. It is a subject that is often put in the categories of conspiracy theories, even though much of what we know about banking and the banking system can really be defined under mainstream history and mainstream economics. But it's a subject that even many Christians do not know much about. It's a subject that many people do not have much wisdom and discernment about. And this is an interesting phenomenon because of the fact that the scriptures actually have quite a bit to say about our money and quite a bit to say about banking and much to say about the system that we are living in, this current international banking system that really dominates the economic system in which we live in. Now, the reason why this particular topic of banking and international banking is important is because of the fact that we are really living under an economic system that has been intentionally designed to gradually enslave us through the means of debt creation. That we are living in a system where our money is constantly being made to be worth less and less, and that we are being pushed into a form of wage slavery through being put into constantly more and more debt through the fiat money system that we live under. Now, one thing I want to clarify right away is I am not in any way arguing against the inherent value of work. We know that work is a gift that was given by God to mankind, and that Adam was working in the paradise that was the Garden of Eden before the fall. So work is not a result of sin entering into the world, but it is something that is inherently part of who God has created us to be. But the reason why the economic system that we are living under is evil is because that form of slavery, it is not allowing us to enjoy the fruits of our labor that should come from doing the work in which God has called us to do. Now, that is why it's very important to understand the economic and monetary system that we are living under that is controlled by the international banking system. So I'm going to start today by reading a verse of scripture, and this verse is 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10, which talks about the love of money. And the reason why this verse is important is because of the fact that much of what goes on with our monetary system is the reason why there is so much manipulation of our money that comes through banking is because of the fact that Satan has ensnared many people with the love of money and the love of pleasure and wealth and comforts in this world. And that has been a tool that he has been able to use to maintain the world system in which we live under. Now, 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10 reads, "For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." Now, this verse from the Authorized Version says that the love of money is the root of all evil, but perhaps a better way to understand it is that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Now, the love of money and the love of what money can give us can really ensnare us away from living a life with a pure conscience before God, and it can lead us to fall into all sorts of evil. And this is really a great verse that defines the world economic system that we live under and the banking system that we live under, where the love of money has led to the creation of this system that has really been used as a mean to exploit and manipulate people all over the world. And I'm going to define what that is. Now, as I have said, the banking system manipulates our money in order to enchain us through the means of debt creation. And what we need to understand is that all banks make their money through the means of giving out loans and charging interest on those said loans. And that the interest in which they charge is the means of their creating their profits to enrich themselves. And this is what the Bible has always defined and condemned as the sin of usury. We find that word in the King James Version of the Scriptures. And the Scriptures are very clear that we are not to charge interest on loans given to our neighbor or given to our brother, and that we are not to profit ourselves through the means of those who are in need, and that for the first 1500 years or so of church history, this was pretty much universally understood by theologians across the board that this was a sin of charging any interest at all as usury. But as time went on, that has been gradually redefined to say that the sin of usury is not charging interest at all, but it has been redefined to mean only charging excessive interest. But when we go to the Scriptures and see what they actually say, we see that the Bible condemns charging interest on loans as the sin of usury. Now we see this very clearly in Exodus 22, verse 25, which says, "If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury." And this is talking about the idea of asking for more than the return of that said loan. And we also see this same concept very clearly in Deuteronomy chapter 23. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 19, it reads, "Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury." So this really shows that usury is that idea of profiting off the loan of a brother. So we see very clearly that usury is a grave sin before God, but this very same sin that the Bible condemns, called usury, has become the very center of the economic system that we are living under, which is what we commonly now call capitalism. Now, as I said in my video on communism, the ideas of private property, private ownership, free trade, etc., and commerce, these are biblical concepts that we see. And by the things I am saying about the banking system is in no means intended to be a condemnation of these biblical thoughts, and is no way advocating for the sinful ideologies of socialism and communism. But we need to understand that the system of capitalism as we know it is really based entirely upon this idea of charging interest. That is the whole idea of what fuels this idea of gaining profit from investments, which comes from loans, from interest, from banking, that these are really the bedrock of our economic system. And we see in Proverbs 22:7 the concept that the borrower is slave to the lender. Now, this is what I was talking about before when I was talking about being gradually enslaved or enchained, as it were, to this idea of wage slavery. That you are being forced to work merely to pay that chain, that ball and chain, as it were, of debt that is tied to you. And that you are not working in order to profit and advance yourself, but you are working only to keep up with those payments of debt that you were owed. We see that as a biblical concept. That is what debt does. It creates the borrower being the slave to the lender. And when we look at the American way of life, we see that debt is a part of every aspect of American life. And that when you look through all of the various stages of life, you see that Americans live in debt from one side of their adult life all the way to the other. That most people in this day and age, when they go to college or go to university, the first thing that they have to do and able to afford their tuition is they have to go and get a loan to pay for their college. And then when they come out of college or university in this day and age, they are coming out with an extremely large amount of debt at that stage of life where they're hoping to get into their careers, buy a house, and get started. And the price of housing in this day and age is very, very high. And the next thing that Americans usually do is they go and they get a house loan, which is Once again, more debt that is owed to the banks, just in the same way that a college loan is debt owed to the banks. And we also see this with car loans, and we also know that the debt that is created through credit cards, and almost every single American has a credit card. So we see that these are all concepts surrounding charging interest, debt, loans, but these things only really scratch the surface of the banking system. This is only things that we see coming from banks, but what about the system of banking as a whole? We see that we are living in an age where the vast majority of Americans are in debt to their banks, and that we are living in a banking system that is centered around a central bank. And in the United States, our monetary system is controlled by a privately owned central bank. And the American central bank that we have in the United States is called the Federal Reserve. Now, the name Federal Reserve is deceptive, because when you hear the name Federal Reserve, you are inclined to think that it is a branch or a segment of the American government, but this is not true. It is not a part of the American government. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned central bank, and it is called a central bank because it is in control of the United States monetary system. And when you study economics around the world, you see that the vast majority of nations around the world have a central bank. There are very few countries left in the world today that do not have central banks running their monetary systems. And the Federal Reserve is in charge of printing our money, and it lends that money to our government at interest. The money that is created by the Federal Reserve is then lent to our government, and is also lent to commercial banks, and that it is the center of the flow of cash that forms our monetary system. And the money that is created by the Federal Reserve is not backed by gold. It is not backed by any other precious metals. And it is just printed by the Federal Reserve, and this is called fiat money, or the fiat money system. And why this is relevant for us is because as the Federal Reserve prints more and more money that is not backed by gold or anything else, and it is lent to our government interest, this creates our phenomenon called inflation, where our money gradually becomes more and more worthless. It becomes worth less and less. And inflation is a tax. It is a hidden tax, because as our money decreases in value and more money is inserted into the monetary system, this forces normal people to have to work harder and harder to pay for the very same things that they had to pay for before. So this is what forces Americans to have to go into more debt to get by and to live the lives that they are living, and have been trained to want to live the lifestyle that Americans live. And this monetary system gradually leads to that form of debt and wage slavery that really defines our system. And what is true in the United States is also true of monetary and economic systems all over the world. Now, we need to understand that the economic system, the banking system, is designed to, the loans that are charged at interest, the inflation created by the Federal Reserve, and then our taxes that come from our government, they are all designed to work together to gradually take wealth away from the citizens and consolidate it in a cabal at the top of the system. Now, taxes are another thing where the Bible clearly states that the government has the right to charge taxes, that we are to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and Christ said that in the context of taxes. But the Bible also clearly states that excessive taxes are tyrannical, and the Bible even goes as far to say that if we are charged a tenth of our wealth in taxes, that is considered extremely high levels of tax. And we live in a day and age where if we were charged 10% of our income in taxes, we are inclined to think that is low. So we are living in a system that is gradually stripping us of more and more of our wealth, and that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, the banking system, they are gradually gaining more and more of our wealth, and that the elite class that owns this system is getting rich while the average citizens are getting slowly deprived of more and more of wealth. I am now going to talk about some of the history of banking and especially central banking. And we can see that from history that these ideas of banking, charging interest, usury, that these concepts go very, very far back in history, even to ancient times. Even from the verses we read in the Old Testament, such as the ones we read before, we see that these ideas of charging interest have been around for quite a long time. But one group that we can look at in the Middle Ages that really made great advances in developing a sophisticated banking system was the Knights Templar. Now, I've talked about the Knights Templar before in other videos, but they were founded as an elite military order of monks that became chivalric knights that fought to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. And after they left the Holy Land, later they continued on as a network of powerful knights in Europe until the point where they were finally disbanded. Now, the Knights Templar were composed from the elite nobility families of Europe, and they, as a means of enriching themselves, developed a very ingenious system of what we can now call banking. And that what they would do is that they would allow pilgrims to take their gold and deposit it at a Knights Templar outpost of a point of where they were traveling in charge for a small fee, and that traveler would be given a slip of paper instead of the bag of gold, which was much safer to travel with, and then they could redeem that piece of paper for the same amount of gold at another outpost further down the route of where they were traveling. So they really developed a system of paper IOUs, which is very similar to what we now would know as paper money. And the other thing that they did is they enriched themselves is that they began lending money to all of the kings of Europe, to the point where many of the kings of Europe became very much in debt to the Knights Templar. And by the time that the order was suppressed in 1314, the King of France, Philip IV of France, who was very instrumental in suppressing the order, he was one of those kings that was greatly indebted to the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar are an interesting group because not only are they instrumental in the history of banking, but they are a precursor group to other secret societies that came after, such as the Jesuits and the Illuminati and the Freemasons, which I've talked about in other videos. So the Knights Templar really played a role in developing banking. And another rise in banking we see came around in Italy in the times of the Renaissance, and especially in the city of Florence. And one of the families that rose to prominence through the use of banking was the Medici family, or the Medici dynasty, that rose up in Florence. And the patriarch of the Medici family, Cosimo de' Medici, he was responsible for taking the Medici Bank, which had been founded in 1397, and he took it from an obscure small Florentine bank and he turned it into a powerful institution that led to the rise of the Medici family. And Cosimo de' Medici, he became known as the godfather of the Renaissance, and his son Lorenzo de' Medici, who became known as Lorenzo de' Magnifico or Lorenzo the Magnificent, he really continued on the legacy of the Medici banking family, and through their use of charging interest, loans, and banking, they became one of the wealthiest families first in Florence and then one of the wealthiest families in all of Italy. And through their wealth, they became patrons for the famous and great Renaissance artists such as Brunelleschi, or Leonardo da Vinci or Donatello or Michelangelo, they were patrons of these artists and the works of art that really formed the Renaissance. And the city of Florence was the center of the early Renaissance, which later spread into other parts of Italy. And the Medici family was also able to use their wealth, which they had gained from their banking, and they were able to use it to buy influence and political power. And first, they were able to get control over the city of Florence to the point where they eventually controlled the city government of the the republic. That the city of Florence was not ruled by a monarch or a king, but it was ruled by a city government, a republican form of government. But the Medici were able to use their wealth to really gain control over the city government. And later they were able to use their wealth to buy political power and influence across Italy and in Rome. And the great Medici family would go on to gain influence over the papacy, and they would produce 4 separate popes that would come from the Medici family. Now, the first Medici pope was Leo X, who was born as Giovanni de Lorenzo de' Medici. He was the son of Lorenzo de Magnifico, and Pope Leo X is the very same pope who later excommunicated Martin Luther and was the pope who stood opposed to the work of Martin Luther as the Protestant Reformation began. And later on, his cousin Giulio de' Medici would go on to become Pope Clement VII. So the Medicis are a great example in history of a family who, through the use of charging interest on loans and banking, were able to gain not only wealth but political power and influence. And this is a great example in history of how those who have large amounts of wealth are able to influence not only economics but the political system. And this is exactly what we see happened, and that the Medicis are one of these famous families that had extreme amounts of power over the papacy, which was really the center of the political world in Europe. In the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance era, before the Protestant Reformation weakened their power, the papacy was the most politically powerful institution in Europe. And it was really the Protestant Reformation that led to a great weakening of that power. And we know that there were powerful families such as the Medicis or the Orsinis or the Borgias or the Del Roveris that had large amounts of power over the papacy, over the Vatican, and over the city of Rome. And the Medici, with their use of banking, was one of those powerful families in Europe. But moving forward in history, we see that another family that was connected to banking and had huge amounts of wealth and political power in the world is the Rothschild family. Now, the Rothschilds are famous for being one of the wealthiest, if not one of the wealthiest families in the entire history of the world. The amount of wealth that they gained from their connection to banking is really astronomical and almost beyond comprehension. Now, the Rothschilds were a Jewish family that the founder of that dynasty, Mayer Amschel de Rothschild, really started the banking dynasty of the Rothschild, and he had his sons go to major cities in Europe where they set up branches of their banking empire in cities such as Vienna, London, Frankfurt, and Naples. And these sons were all very successful in their banking endeavors, and it led the family to become greatly enriched and very powerful. Now the Rothschilds are also famous for being connected to the secret societies and particularly connected to the Illuminati, and that they have always been one of these famous families that are connected to the work of the secret societies, and they have always been connected to that secret world. But we see that when you study the Rothschilds, you see that they were able to use banking as a way to enrich themselves, and then they were able to take the wealth that they gained from banking, and once again they were able to use it to exert political power over the nations in which they ruled. A very famous example of this was Mayor Amschel de Rothschild's son, Nathan Rothschild, who went to London. And through his use of banking and also through his investments on the London Stock Exchange, he became extraordinarily wealthy. He was able to gain huge amounts of wealth, and then he was able to use that wealth and take it to exert a great deal of influence over the British government. Now, there's even a quote attributed to him where he said, "If I control the nation's money supplies, I do not care who makes its laws." Now, it must be noted that that quote has been questioned by some historians whether it is valid or not. But whether that quote is true or not, we know that that is essentially what Nathan Rothschild was able to do in his life. He was able to enrich himself through banking. He was able to enrich himself through his investments, and he did use that wealth alongside the other members of the Rothschild family to exert political power on the world scene. And a good example of how that wealth tribulated to political influence is the fact that the Rothschilds in the Austrian Empire and in the British Empire were ennobled and became part of the nobility of those two respective empires. And as I said, we know that the Rothschilds were connected to the Illuminati from the very beginning, and that when one understands the work of the Illuminati and the secret societies connected to it, we understand that there have always been wealthy and powerful families that have been the center of that occult network, that they have always worked together, they have always intermarried with each other, they've networked together, and that these families have always been in control of much of the economic, monetary, and financial systems of the world, and that these powerful families have also been connected to other phenomena such as Luciferianism and the occult, which is the bedrock of the belief systems of groups such as the Illuminati. And the Rothschilds are one of these families that has been connected to that occult world, and that their wealth has come through these exploitive systems of banking. And another interesting phenomenon is the fact that in the 19th century, the Rothschilds became the papal bankers for the papacy, for the Vatican, for the popes, and that they were able to lend their money to the popes, that they were the guardians of the papal treasury. And so we see that this is another great example in history of how the secret societies such as the Illuminati or the Freemasons, which have always claimed to be in opposition to the Catholic Church and to the papacy, are in actuality just another side of the same coin. And we see this through the relationship that the papacy had with the Rothschild family, where the Rothschilds were the protectors, the guardians of the Vatican treasury, that they were God's bankers. But moving on from the Rothschild family, we next come to the history of the United States. And much could be said about the United States and the founding of the United States. We see that the American Revolution is a complex part of history where there were good and bad influences on it, where on the one hand, the American colonies that ended up participating in the American Revolution, they did have a strong Christian heritage in the sense that there were many Christians living in the colonies, that the Great Awakening, which was a true revival of God through the work of preachers such as George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, did have a powerful influence on the colonies, where there was a strong Christian tradition in the Americas, but there was also a strong occult tradition through groups such as the Rosicrucians or the Freemasons, and that in the American Revolution, these forces were both at work in separate ways, influencing the historical events that led to the founding of America. And all throughout the history of the United States, there has always been the Christian influence on the United States, and then also that occult tradition influencing the United States, and that those two antithetical forces have always been, to one extent or another, they've always been at war, as it were, for the soul of the United States. But what happened was, after the events of the American Revolution, there was a brief period of the government of the Articles of Confederation, but then there was the Constitutional Convention and the founding of the American Republic. as we know it under the U.S. Constitution. And in regards to banking, there were two political factions that really emerged. There was the Democratic Republican Party led by Thomas Jefferson that emerged as one political faction under the early American government, and then there was the Federalist Party led by Alexander Hamilton. And these two parties had completely different views of central banking. The one party was completely opposed to central banks in all its forms, while the other political party was in favor of central banks in its entirety. We see that Thomas Jefferson was completely opposed to central banks. He believed that they were exploitive, that they were detrimental to the health and prosperity of the nation, and that Alexander Hamilton, in contrast, believed that they were indisputably necessary for the future of the country. And the reason why these two men had such contrary views is because of the fact that they had completely different visions of what America should be. And that Thomas Jefferson believed in strong individual liberty. Even though Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian, even though he held many ideas or tenets of his belief system that were not true or not right, he was a very brilliant man, and he did advocate for many things that are true. And many of his political and economic principles are, in fact, principles that we can say align to one extent or another with a biblical worldview. And he understood that governments can become tyrannical very, very easily, and that citizens need to be very vigilant against the abuse of power. Thomas Jefferson understood that if there are not checks and balances in place, that governments will always usurp and take more and more power for themselves. And Thomas Jefferson envisioned a republic where there was going to be private property ownership. He believed in free trade. He believed in no central bank controlling the nation's money supply. And he believed that there should be a system where the individual was enriched. And this was completely contrasted by the vision of Alexander Hamilton, who saw his political party, the Federalist Party, as the parties of the elites. He believed, in contrast to Jefferson's view of small government, he believed that there should be a strong central government over the state governments, and he believed that a central bank was a great means of granting greater authority to the central government. And he was the Secretary of the Treasury under the first president, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton had a plan for the central government to take on the debts that had been accrued by the individual states during the Revolutionary War, because he believed that if the more responsibility that was given to the bank would increase the power of the government. And he saw his Federalist Party as an elitist party that would be the party of the wealthy and the powerful. He had more of a vision of empire for America than a citizen's republic, and he was a great agent in favor of the use of central banks. But Thomas Jefferson understood that central banks were a means of enslavement of the American people, and he even went as far to say this. Jefferson said, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continents that their fathers occupied. The ensuing power of money should be taken from the banks and restored to Congress and the people to whom it belongs. I sincerely believe that the banking institutions are more dangerous to liberty than standing armies." So Thomas Jefferson understood very, very clearly how dangerous banks were to the prosperity of the nation. And when one studies the history of the United States, one of the reasons why the United States has historically been such a prosperous country is because for much of its history it had been free from the control of central banks. It's only in the 20th century where we see that central banks have really consolidated their grip over this nation, and it has led to a gradual impoverishing step by step of what has historically been a greatly prosperous nation. And when we look at the history of central banks in the United States, we see that the first bank that was set up in 1791 was the first bank of the United States. And its original charter only had a certain amount of time granted to it. And then in 1811, when the charter of the first bank expired, it was not renewed by Congress. And many people, such as the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson, were greatly against the central bank and its role in American society. But the First National Bank came to an end in 1811, but a few years later, it was replaced by the Second National Bank, which came into existence in 1816. And it would exist for around 20 years until it was abolished in 1836, largely due to the efforts of Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson was the seventh president of the United States, and he stood in the Jeffersonian political tradition of opposition to central banks, and he saw that they were a means of enslaving the common American people. And so, despite all of his flaws as a person, he correctly saw that he needed to fight against ending the central bank in the United States. So he really dedicated himself, especially in his second term as president, to ending the second central bank. And he succeeded in doing that, even despite all of the political intrigues and even an assassination attempt that was leveled against him. And he was able to successfully demolish the Second National Bank. And at one point he even said to the bankers, he said, "Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I have had men watching you for a long time and convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves, and I have determined to rout you out. And by the eternal, I will rout you out." So Andrew Jackson correctly saw that they were a den of vipers and thieves, and he did correctly rout them out, as he said. He was able to destroy and end the charter of the Second National Bank. And later in life, before his death, he said that one of his greatest achievements was that the fact that he killed the bank. And because of that, there was not another central bank in the United States until 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created. And instead of being called the Third National Bank, which is what it truly is, it is the Third National Bank of the United States, it was called the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve came into being because of men such as J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, and they were able to successfully push the bill approving the Federal Reserve through Congress, and it was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson, who had even promised that he would sign it before entering the presidency. So Woodrow Wilson was a man who was indebted to the banking interest, and he led to the signing of the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve and handed over the printing of our nation's money from the Treasury Department to the privately owned central bank that we now know as the Federal Reserve. And the other act that came into being at this point in history was the creation of the revenue of federal income tax, where before this in American history, Americans paid no federal income tax. It was only in 1913 where this began to be true. And when we think about this, we think that it's only been a little over 100 years where Americans have paid federal income tax. Before, there were other taxes, state taxes and what have you, but this idea of federal income tax has really it's a relatively recent phenomenon in American history. And that phenomenon of increasingly high federal taxes employed with the policies of the Federal Reserve has had huge detrimental effects on the prosperity of the American people. Now, much more could be said on central banks and on the effects that they have detrimentally had on not only the United States but the entire world, but I will limit myself to a few examples. The first thing that can be said is that many credible historians have correctly said that many of the economic crises, such as the Great Depression that was caused by the 1929 stock market crash and then the 2008 financial crisis, have been a result directly of the detrimental banking policies of central banks and banks in general. That the things that they have done have led to greater instability in the economy and in the markets of the American economy. And what we need to understand about Wall Street in particular, when we especially think of the 2008 financial crash, is that the large Wall Street firms, they are banks, and that that the banking system and Wall Street are really two sides of the same coin. And another phenomenon that we understand from central banks is that bankers, especially those who own the central banks, they have been able to profit greatly from wars that have been waged around the world because of the fact that when they are in control of a nation's money supply and they are lending money to those said governments at interest, that they are able to profit greatly from wars because of the fact that when governments have to pay for the expenses to keep their militaries running and to wage the wars that they are fighting, that forces them to go into more debt, which means that they have to go and get that money from the banks, which is enriching to the banks because they are getting more loans and more money. And wars are extremely expensive endeavors because of the fact that, first of all, military equipment is extraordinarily expensive. And the second thing is because everything that gets built and created for combat specifically gets sent into combat and is destroyed. So everything that is getting created oftentimes does not have lasting value because of the fact that you are sending it to be destroyed. So wars are extremely efficient in creating debt for a government, and that they are detrimental to governments, but they are enriching to banks. Now, history is complicated. We can't say that every war has been caused surely for debt creation or for enriching banks, but this is a phenomenon that has been the cause for certain wars in history, alongside the other political motivations for starting wars, and that the bankers around the world, the central banks around the world, have profited greatly from the wars that have been fought around the world. And the Illuminati, which is the organization which has created many wars and revolutions in history, have been able to benefit because of their influence and control over much of the banking system in the world. So we see that central banking is connected to a war economy and the desire to create wars in order to enrich the elite class over this world. And that is very true. Now, the final point I want to talk about is, what does the Bible say about the center of the economic system? Now, Bible prophecy tells us just as where is the center of the world political scene, it also tells us where is the center of the world economic or financial scene. And this is the anti-Christian system, the Antichrist system of Rome, the Vatican, the papacy, which is called in Revelation Mystery Babylon. That city, the city of Rome, or the city in Revelation 17, the city of seven mountains, or the city of seven hills, that is the center of the world financial and economic system. Now, we know that history has really validated this. We've already seen certain examples of this, such as powerful and wealthy families such as the Medicis or the Rothschilds being connected to the Vatican. But more importantly, we see that Bible prophecy tells us specifically the place that the city of Rome has in the financial scene. And we see this specifically in Revelation 18, which talks about the prophesied destruction of the city of Rome and the Antichrist system that is seated there, and how the merchants will weep over the destruction of this city because it is the center of their commerce, and they have been greatly enriched by being in league with this great whore which is situated in this ancient city of Rome, what Revelation 17 calls the city of seven mountains, or in other words, the city of 7 hills. In Revelation chapter 18, verses 15 through 18 say this: "The merchants of these things, which were made rich by her," that's referring to the city of Rome, "shall stand afar off for the fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city, that was clothed in fine linen, and purple, and scarlet, and decked with gold, and precious stones, and pearls. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught. And every shipmaster, and all the company, and ships, and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, stood afar off, and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like unto this great city?" Now, the question that has to be asked is, what is that city that is burning that the merchants are weeping over? And the scriptures are very, very clear of what the identity of that city is. I have already said it. It's very clear in Revelation 17. "And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth." And that's Revelation 17 verse 18. And Revelation 17:9 says, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits," or sitteth. And that word 7 mountains can also be understood as 7 hills. The Bible clearly tells us that the city of Rome is the center of this system, and that the mystery Babylon, the great whore, the Roman Catholic system controlled by the Pope of Rome, it is in league with the kings of the earth, and it is also in league with the merchants of the earth. Now, many more examples historically could be given to show that this is true. There have been many great books written about the wealth of the Vatican in modern times. A great example of this is the book The Vatican Billions by Averell Manhattan, where he talks about, amongst other things, their wealth that has been, where they have had great amounts of control over the American stock market, and they have been able to make themselves increasingly wealthy through this. We can think of, there is another great book called The Vatican Empire by Nino Lobello, which talks about the great financial assets. We think that the Catholic Church is one of the greatest landholders in the world, and this is proven simply by the fact of all the churches, cathedrals, and basilicas they own all over the world. And we also can think of the fact that they have been connected to banking all throughout their history. But in modern times, a great example of this is the story of the Vatican Bank that even played out in the 1970s and the 1980s in history. And one man who was in charge of running the central bank, or not the central bank, the Vatican Bank, was a man called Paul Marcinkus, who was an American archbishop who was one of the highest American prelates in the Vatican at that time. And this was an American archbishop who had connections to the CIA, and he also had connections to the Italian and American mafias. And he worked closely with another man called Roberto Calvi, and Roberto Calvi was in charge of the bank called the Banco Ambrosiano. And the Vatican Bank and this bank, the Banco Ambrosiano, worked very closely together. And Roberto Calvi is a very interesting individual because he was a member of the group called the P2 Masonic Lodge, otherwise known as Propaganda Do, which had huge amounts of influence and political power in Italy. And he was also connected to the mafia on both sides of the Atlantic. And obviously, as I have already said, Roberto Calvi had his connections to the Vatican. So we see how the World Intelligence Services, the mafia, the Vatican, etc., even Freemasonry and the secret societies, how there were, in modern times, examples of how all these groups were connected together. But what happened in 1982 was that the Banco Ambrosiano, ran by Roberto Calvi, failed, and it was a multi-billion-dollar failure, and it was discovered that millions of dollars of funds in this bank that was going under in 1982 were missing. And as investigations went on, we found it was discovered that there was embezzlement involved, and the men connected to this embezzlement, as we well know, were of course Roberto Calvi and Paul Marcinkus. And this was a great banking scandal that really rocked the world at that time in history. And what happened was Roberto Calvi was, in that year 1982, was found dead in London, and he was found dead under extremely bizarre and strange circumstances, to say the least, where he was found hanging from a London bridge, and he had bricks in his pockets. And at first it was deemed that he was found dead by suicide, but then later it was correctly vindicated that he had been killed by homicide. And so he had been killed because of his role in this banking scandal. And the fact that he had bricks in his pockets and he was hanging from a bridge, the way he was found dead had Masonic overtones to it, to say the least. And then the Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who had been connected to him, he was indicted for his role in the scandal, although never convicted. But despite that scandal, he continued on in his role in control of the Vatican Bank. And even as you move forward in history, the Vatican Bank has had allegations of corruption connected to it, even in the 2000s and the 2010s, coming all the way up to 2023, where there have been many allegations of financial mismanagement, corruption, embezzlement, etc., connected to the Vatican Bank. So we see that the Vatican and the Vatican Bank are very much connected to the world financial system. Now, after going through all of this history, in conclusion, what principles can we take away as Christians from this understanding of banking and the banking system? And the first thing we can say very practically, after seeing what the scriptures say about debt, is we as Christians should do everything we can in our power to avoid debt. And this is a reality that challenges the way that Americans are taught to live in the United States, of constantly living beyond their means. Now, it is not inherently sinful to take out a loan or to have some amount of debt with the understanding that you are able to pay it back. The scriptures clearly teach that we are to pay our debts. But we must also understand that even though we may have the liberty to take out loans, it is very foolish to live a lifestyle of having a giant burden of debt upon our shoulders. And I do not believe that the Lord has intended for us to live constantly in perpetual enslaving debt from the cradle to the grave. So we as Christians should strive as much as in our ability to live a life free of continual debt. And the second thing that we should desire is, as Christians, is that we should desire to have magistrates that are opposed to central banks. Now, at this point, I am not advocating for political activism here, but we as Christians do have liberties in interacting with the political system through things such as voting or desiring certain candidates to take power. We should want those who are opposed to central banks. Now, this was once a very common thing in the United States for politicians to oppose central banks. And nowadays, even the more conservative candidates will never ever speak about central banks, and that talking about that has been relegated to the term of conspiracy theory, even though it was once considered just mainstream history or mainstream political theory. So we should desire that those in power are opposed to the enslaving effects of central banks. As the scriptures tell us, the people rejoice when the righteous are in power. As we pray for the Lord to give us righteous magistrates, and as we do what God has entrusted for us to do to help for righteous magistrates to take power, we should desire that those who are in power are opposed to central banks. And the third and final point is that we should have wisdom and discernment about the banking system and about the evils associated with the banking system, and we should take what steps we can to avoid those evils as much as we can. Now, I do not believe it's sinful to place our money in banks. It is not sinful to have, quote, a bank account, and that the way the system is set up, it is very, very difficult for us to completely remove ourselves from the evils of the financial system. But we need to do what we can to understand the way the system works and to ask the Lord through prayer to give us wisdom of what we should be doing to avoiding the evils of the banks, and especially the large banks, through steps. Maybe it's banking locally, or maybe other ways of managing our money that may give greater glory to God. And we just need to understand that we are living in this economic system, and whatever ways we can understand it and understand how to interact with it, we are going to be better off to serve the kingdom as Christians. And we see that we do not want to be given over to that spirit of greed, but we want to have the understanding that we are called to be stewards of our money for the glory of God. And finally, we do see that the study of history and even the study of economics is profitable endeavors for us as Christians. We may not be able to perfectly understand these things, but we do see that understanding some of these issues is going to be beneficial to us as Christians having discernment in a dark and sinful world. So as I always say, guys, with all of these topics, just study banks, study how the banking system works, have some understanding of it, have an understanding of especially what the scriptures say about interest, loans, debt, banking, and by understanding God's word, understanding history, and understanding this issue of banking, we're going to have greater discernment to be a light in a dark and sinful world. So that all being said, guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Through Ministries. God bless.